What if I told you that there's an approach to using the memory palace technique that doesn't require using familiar buildings or even locations at all, at least not locations in the way we normally think about it? Imagine being able to memorize the key points from books to improve your understanding of a foreign language by adding new vocabulary and sometimes even phrases, and possibly even delivering simple speeches without using notes, simply by using, instead of a building, something like a cube or a circle, a triangle, or a square as a memory palace. Today, I'm going to reveal the secret of purely geometrical memory palaces, a revolutionary approach that may make your use of traditional memory palaces go away, at least some of the time. Now please don't skip around this video tutorial because I don't want you to miss any of the detail on how you'll harness the power of geometry to create potentially, and I do mean potentially, infinite storage spaces. None of us are going to live that long for infinity to kick in, assuming infinity is what most of us think that it is, because it probably isn't, because most of us aren't physicists or mathematicians. But this isn't just a silly memory trick. And even if it were a memory trick, I once asked Harry Lorraine what he thought about calling mnemonics tricks. And he said, well, it's like magic. Whether it's a trick or not is irrelevant as long as it creates an effect. I've always loved that memory of discussing that with Harry Lorraine. It's not a trick. Using geometry could be the key to unlocking your mind's true potential, especially if you're a person who doesn't have access to a lot of buildings, locations, etc., upon which to base your memory palaces. And this key, it's been hiding in plain sight for centuries. Now, before we dive into all the details, hit that subscribe button if you're new here and you love mental adventures that improve your memory. Better memory equals better living in our little world here. And make sure you hit that notification bell so you don't miss a thing, because there's a lot coming up in our journey to better and better memory and better living as a result. And for those of you who are already here, for the love of memory, hit that thumbs up to help our community keep reminding those robots that we humans care about the memory that we carry in our cranial or cephalic-shaped skulls. Or is this skull perhaps best described as an irregular ellipsoid, or is it an ovoid shape? Well, it's something to learn over time, every time I look in the mirror, using the shapes themselves as memory palaces to help me remember the words. And isn't it cool to be able to remember words like that? No matter how challenging they are, memory techniques are the way forward for most of us. So, appeals to, getting subscribed and all that aside, what shape is the subscribe button, by the way, would you say? We're going to work directly with geometrical shapes and how they can be a game changer for you. But I want to quickly review what the traditional memory palace technique is, just for those of you who are new to it. And it's always good to review these things because repetition is the mother of learning. So a memory palace uses a familiar location, like your home or your workplace or a school or a church or a movie theater, etc. And you place items that you lay out at specific points in your imagination. And it's this familiarity with the space that allows you to go from the corner of a room to a chair that helps you recall the way that you've placed that information there. Now, you don't just place information cold, you warm it up by adding associations. So when I memorized Megaston Topos Hapantagar Kori, which is from Thales, the idea that space is ultimate because it contains all things, well, I just had a place where I put Megatron from the Transformer series, right? And so then that's in a corner of a room, and I go back and recall the information by, so to speak, mentally walking through the apartment where I placed that and retrieving the items in order. And in this case, it's a series of items that help me get back the entire phrase. And it doesn't matter if it's in Greek, it doesn't matter if it's in whatever language it might be in. What we're relying on is a heavy personal association and familiarity with the chosen location. So what makes geometry any different? If I want to take a triangle or a circle or a square or indeed a cube, well, not to be Captain Obvious here, but instead of using a real-world location, I'm using the abstract geometric shape and the space that is created by the lines of the shape, no matter what shape it might be. It's based on geometry using points, lines, planes, solids, and not necessarily referring to any actual location in the world. But you do have the benefit of being able to impose geometrical shapes on locations, extending a memory palace. So if I wanted to expand that area, I could have a triangle or a prism or a sphere in the corner of that room, which would allow me to have more stations in the memory palace. So it's a really, really great technique because instead of having like one piece of information in a corner or on a chair, the pyramid would potentially give you several tiers, and then you can arrange information in those tiers according to hierarchical importance. And I'll give you an example of what I mean later. But just as a general overview, this is what you can do. If you think about using hand memory palaces, which I do more and more often these days since I learned about it from Tyson Yunkaporta in Sandtalk, well, you can combine using your hand as a memory palace with the sphere technique to turn a fingertip into a globe with many more options. So in Sandtalk, I believe if memory serves, it is connect, reflect, respect, direct. Now, those are just one piece of information for each fingertip. But if I were to imagine a sphere on each fingertip, then I've got at least the 4 cardinal directions, if not more, to make more stations per finger. So what the approach potentially allows you to do is organize memory palace journeys in a structured, logical, mathematical way that when done well can be added to many, many other locations or just expanded potentially infinitely because you're not limited by physical space. You could have these spheres not on your fingertips, but just going out into infinity, right? Now, this can lead to consequences, such as not being able to remember which directions that you followed, not being able to remember how many spheres that you laid out in the void of your mind. So it's important to use this technique cautiously, sparingly, or at least it is for me, because sometimes the cognitive load that it creates is not that useful. Now, as you know, it's the mandate of this channel to also always, wherever possible, talk about the history of memory techniques, so we want to pause. Where does this idea of using geometrical shapes come from? Ultimately, I don't think we know. I mean, if Stonehenge was a memory palace, it's essentially geometrical shapes that are in some place, which then could be referred to mentally as shapes in order to use as a memory palace. So there might be that. We know, as I just talked about the hands thing from Tyson Yunkaporta, that hands have been used in the Aboriginal tradition for a very, very long time, offloading information that needed to be remembered onto these physical structures. Is it geometry in an abstract sense? No, but as we've seen, it can be expanded and it can help you offload more information onto objects that are built by the hand, such as Lucasa, memory sticks, etc. But perhaps the way that I've first seen it in the deepest possible historical sense, expanded to be purely abstract, is in Bruno's 30 Seals. And this edition has 30 Seals and the Seal of Seals, which is produced by Scott Gosnell, who translated it. And if you look inside of this guide, well, it gets deep into using geometrical shapes. You've got a means of imposing a geometrical understanding onto the sky, for example, or you can use a tree in a particular way as a reference. Circles, squares, triangles, all of this becomes the basis for complex memory systems. And as far as I can tell, Bruno believed that these shapes could represent not just spaces for memorizing things, but also universal truths. And the knowledge of geometry itself could help you encode more things. So it's kind of like the more you know, the more you can know principle. In any case, if you haven't read Bruno, I know he's really tough, but it's worth it. And it's groundbreaking work. And frankly, it's still groundbreaking work, even though it's old, because as David Berglis reminds us in A Question of Memory, we all have to interpret the traditional wisdom of the memory tradition in our own way. We have to contend with it. And the more that you contend with it, the more you're going to get out of it. So, hop to it. And I hope that this channel encourages you to do so and gives you ideas and ways to think about it. But it's nothing I can say is ever a replacement for going out, doing your own study and your own experiments. So let's just get started with how this might work. If you're going to do something like this, pick a shape. It might be a cube, for example. By the way, these cards are created by John Michael Greer. They come in a box, and it's the Sacred Geometry Oracle book and card deck. And I got these for several reasons, my research and so forth. But they're really cool in terms of giving you a bunch of shapes to learn about. The mathematical formulas are there. There's some ideas in the realm of sacred geometry, what they all might mean. This one says stability and rigidity as a potential metaphorical meaning, or however you want to think about that. Anyway, there's visualization exercises that you can do and reflection exercises. I think it's quite fun to work with. And basically, all you have to do is pick a shape. Maybe keep it simple. Start with something familiar, like a cube or a sphere or a pyramid. A cylinder. You could go maybe to a torus, which is a donut shape, or an octahedron, or a dodecahedron, which is one I really, really like. In any case, pick something that's quite simple. And let's use an example here, using a cube. Let's say you're studying a history exam on World War II, and you could more or less use this kind of structure to help you encode the overarching details of just about any war, actually. So if you think about assigning to a cube on its faces the major aspects of a war, you might have on one face, the front face, the key figures involved in the war, maybe using the four corners. On the back, you would have major battles. And then on the top face, maybe you'd start to encode the basic timeline, so when it started and when it ended. And then on the bottom, you might have causes and effects. Left side, you could have maybe if there were allied powers like World War II, and then on the right side, the Axis powers, etc. Now, let's say that you've done this for an exam. Well, a lot of people, I still don't understand why this happens. They say, well, when you're in your exam, just go into your memory palace or go to your cube memory palace and then recall what you placed there. No. This is Sherlock Holmes fantasy, I must go to my mind palace nonsense. You don't want to sit in an exam and mentally rotate cubes around in your head to the relevant face where you have the dates of Churchill or something like that. No, you just want it to be in your long-term memory so you see the question and you answer it. So in order to do that, whether it's a traditional memory palace or a geometrical memory palace, you want to give yourself time to encode, but also to decode and use spaced repetition. This is something covered in depth elsewhere on this channel, especially in the spaced repetition video, so you may want to go through that thoroughly. But the point is that you have this option. Not only can you just, in the void of your mind, rotate a cube around and have on the faces or different parts of the cube information that you want to remember, but you also have the option of placing multiple cubes in memory palaces. So if I had a cube here, that's going to give me a number of faces that expands the amount of space that's right here in this part of the memory palace. And then I can have another one here. So this no longer is just one space, but in the case of a cube, as many faces as possible. In the case of a dodecahedron, as many faces as is on that object, right? If it's going to be a prism, then you have that amount of spaces. You've multiplied the amount of space by having an imaginary object there, right? You could do this, for example, if you were studying German. So this is a little bit different in terms of geometry. It wasn't a sphere or anything, but I had to pass an immigration exam in order to have permanent residence there. I had to show language skills in German, but also an understanding of Germany. So it wasn't a sphere exactly, but that country has a particular shape. And I used the shape of Germany itself to help me remember the bordering countries and then the Bundesländer within it, and I was able to think of where different borders were by thinking about basic shapes. So that's another thing that you could do, but you could impose mentally a circle on it and help yourself by dividing it into a kind of pie shape that would give you a better sense of quadrants, right? So the northeast quadrant versus the southwest quadrant, that sort of thing is really, really interesting to play around with. But let's say you want to apply it to just an abstract sphere, right? For the parts of speech. Well, one thing you could do is divide the sphere, this is totally abstract, into latitudinal bands. And it would represent, maybe you have the North Pole is going to be where you think about nouns. You have the upper northern hemisphere where you have verbs like arbeiten. By the way, this would be hard work to do it this way, but you could, because you need a really, really big sphere to have in the northern hemisphere all kinds of words. But, if you like arbeiten, well, then you've got it. And would you verdienen, which means to earn much memory this way? Well, it's up to you to explore and find out. You could have on the equator adjectives. On the lower southern hemisphere, you could have adverbs. The South Pole, you could have prepositions and conjunctions. Something to experiment with. Or you could use the longitudinal lines to categorize words and phrases thematically. So at 0 degrees, you could have family and relationships. 90 degrees, work and education. Travel and transport at 180. 90 would be food and drink, etc. But you are not going to avoid wanting to have proper recall rehearsal. It's the key so that you don't have to navigate to the position of arbeiten in your sphere or on your sphere to figure out, a verb, or a thematic category. I doubt Giordano Bruno ever did any such thing when he had to remember something. Oh, I must find my globe and the 90th degree, No, I don't think so. I think he would have used it through reflective thinking, any geometrical shape that he used, in order to get it into long-term memory by revisiting it on a pattern. And if not, then he was probably kind of slow at recalling information. Anyway, if you're loving these memory boosting techniques, you're really just scratching the surface of what's possible. So if you haven't already taken the free course on my site, feel free to grab it using the link in the description. Soon I'm going to be opening again my inner circle where you can access advanced training modules. There's live Q&A sessions and a supportive community of people who love memory, and we get together and we have these really in-depth conversations. But it's only offered to people who have at least taken this free course, so make sure you grab that link. And when registration opens for the next inner circle, don't delay, because we are going deeper and deeper into these topics in the program. Now, how about using a pyramid, perhaps for a simple presentation? So I'm talking about keywords and bullet points only, not like when I did my TEDx talk. When I did my TEDx talk, I used a traditional memory palace, not exactly verbatim, but in some parts of that speech, totally verbatim, because I had either already memorized some Sanskrit passages, or there were parts where I memorized quotes. There's 2 quotes from different authors who wrote in English in that speech, and I memorized them word for word in the memory palace. But if I was going to do a speech and use, say, a tetrahedron or maybe just a straight up triangle as a memory palace, I'd probably do this, because this is kind of like something that I've done just based on acronyms, actually. I would have just one face and then have the speech laid out in a kind of hierarchy of what it is that I'm going to do. So let's say you're going to do a full-on prism, right? On the front face, you could have your introduction. On the left face, you could have main point 1, main point 2 on the next face, and then at the base, you could have your conclusion. Or you could just divide a straight triangle into thirds and have the introduction in subsections or key points laid out. So what I've done, it's not a triangle, but it's a pillar. It doesn't have the progression of roots in it either. But basically, I have this kind of shape in mind when I give some of my public talks. And rather than memorize a speech verbatim, which would be very unusual, I just go in, and then at the top of this pillar, I have the letter F, then I have R and E in my mind. And while I'm talking to people, I just base my speech around FREE. And I won't give that speech now, but it's beautiful because I am following a pattern. I know what I want to say first. I know what I want to say second, third, and fourth. And I just keep it very, very simple. And I don't have to use a traditional memory palace, but I can see myself mentally descending in this case because I start at the top of this pillar and move through the parts of the free acronym. And I have other acronyms like DOC, for example, which I used to use a lot on live streams. And I'm just mentally moving through it. And, it just keeps things free and flowing. And it's a lot of fun. And if I was just starting and I really needed those shapes, I might think about using a triangle or so forth. But at the end of the day, there's no way to use space as a memory palace that I'm aware of that doesn't use space. Whether it's an imagined space or a real space, there's going to be geometrical shapes involved. So no matter what you do, you got to make the journey in such a way that you can navigate logically from point to point to point, and you do want to use it in terms of recall rehearsal to get it into your long-term memory, because while you're talking, I can't imagine rotating from left to right to see different faces and somehow call back my main points. I would want them to be in long-term memory. And in a way, when you think about a traditional memory palace, when I'm looking in my mind to get the information into long-term memory, moving through the memory palace to practice, it's me that's rotating. It's my perspective that moves around. The space stays solid, but there's still rotation around geometrical shapes. A tree is a geometrical shape or a series of shapes altogether. So really the question is, how viable is it to use geometry? And I would just say, Megaston topos habantagar kori. Space is ultimate because it contains all things. And when I memorize that, the shape is already geometrical. It's just that it's not abstract because the corner of that memory palace is fixed in space. And because it's a corner, I often think of it as an eternal station. But it's me or my viewpoint that rotates around the space. But it is a great mental practice. And just rotating shapes in your mind will strengthen your visualization. It will change what you think mental imagery is. And that's a beautiful thing because you're going to be exercising your memory as well. So the examples we talked about today, it's really just scratching the surface of the versatility of what you can do, not just using geometrical shapes to source possible memory palaces, but to completely rethink what traditional memory palaces are. The cube offers quite a structured approach for placing information on different faces. I think it's a lot easier than a sphere, but you may resonate more with practicing with a sphere. And the prism has the problem of, rotating around to these different faces, and it doesn't exactly roll like a memory wheel might, but potentially you have with a triangle a hierarchical structure that may be perfect for ordering in your mind as you're thinking about your speech. What would be the highest point that you save for last? What would be the foundational part that you start with? So it can be useful just in terms of organizing information, even if you don't use these shapes as the memory palace at the end of the day. I got one more geometrical exercise for you that I think you're going to love. But first, thanks everybody for those thumbs up, for being subscribed if you're new here. And speaking of these kinds of exercises, I've got a new book coming out soon called The Memory Advantage, 52 weekly memory exercises that you can dive into over the course of a year. So make sure that you are subscribed for notifications about that, especially on my website. And thank you. Always, it's always an honor to do these trainings for you. So when it comes to geometrical shapes, one last thing you can try, assuming you have a deck of cards, and even if you don't, you can look up pictures of decks of cards. Well, actually, would it be all right if I did two different additional suggestions here for you? The first, and this is something that I've practiced off and on, and it's a lot of fun to do, is memorize cards at the same time as you're listening to podcasts and use the cards as a memory palace. So if this is the Four of Clubs, let's say, I'm going to have my image for the Four of Clubs because I've got to remember that it's the Four of Clubs. And as the podcast is going, I place a point on this corner. So whatever that point might be, try to imagine, almost like having a sphere or a fingertip right here. Imagine what you're going to place on that corner, and then the next point comes, and you use that corner, and that corner. So that's really, really challenging. And, to be fair, it falls apart. It doesn't work very well. But if you think about John Graham, who won the USA Memory Championships 3 times, and he's been a guest on the Magnetic Memory Method podcast at least 3 times, well, he talks about chaos training, literally going out of your way to make it as difficult as possible. And this is one solution that I came up with to make things chaotic. Listening to a podcast, memorizing the card, and then memorizing a couple of points while I'm listening to a podcast, and then moving on to the next card and thinking, okay, so George Orwell and Animal Farm is my image for the 3 of hearts. So now I've got to remember that, this was 4 clubs, I think I said, and 3 of hearts. And so I've got to remember now those 2 things interacting, but another 4 points on the shape of the card. Again, it falls apart, but it's great, great, great exercise. So that's one thing. The other thing is that if you take just any card, I'll use a concrete example here first. This has 2 wheels in it. So if you use the memory wheel technique, well, you could actually have 2 memory wheels on the bicycle deck joker. And if you are so lucky as to have a black and white joker and a color joker, well, now you've got even more. So inside of 2 cards, you could have 4 memory wheels that encode different things. And so now this is geometry inside of geometry. So you could have the 4 corners and then the 2 wheels. Each wheel has at least north, south, east, and west. Oh man, this is amazing, isn't it? Not to mention the points on the king's crown, etc. And you have the color crown and you have the black and white crown. And to get more abstract, you can think of all the possible shapes just on the 3 of hearts, right? So there's the heart shape, which has multiple shapes that you could think of unto itself. And, well, there's things about 3, if you really think about it, and how that 3 is reflected throughout the deck in the way that 3s are constructed that is actually different than how aces are constructed. This is a deep, deep secret from the realm of magic, card magic, that is, that I shall reserve for the future. So as always, get subscribed if you're new here. Hit that thumbs up if you love using your mind and your memory. And more trainings are coming soon on this channel. If you want to carry on with some of these issues and think about how to teleport from one memory palace to the other, whichever cards you're using, and teleport from here into a real memory palace, go ahead and watch my video on how to master multiple memory palaces next, because we have some suggestions about teleporting between memory palaces, no matter what they're made of.